Let's go over some of the prerequisites that you need to have coming into this course. This is an Angular course. This course is focused on Angular HTTP. So the assumption is that you already know Angular, you've probably used it, and you just want to improve your knowledge on the HTTP communication that is built into Angular. So you need to understand Angular. And the second technology you need to understand is TypeScript. So again, the assumption here will be that you know TypeScript because Angular uses TypeScript. So understanding of TypeScript and Angular, you need to have background in those two technologies. Now, another thing I want to point out is that saying that you need to have some TypeScript background also implies that you need to understand JavaScript because TypeScript is more like a wrapper around JavaScript. So if you know TypeScript, I'm assuming that you also know JavaScript. And then you need to understand HTTP because this is the protocol that is used over the internet, and that's the protocol that we're going to be using to make requests. Now, I'm not expecting you to have any in-depth knowledge of the HTTP protocol, but as long as you understand what requests and response and headers and things like that, as long as you understand what those are, then you should be good to go. We're going to cover a lot of this in this course as well, but just so you know what to expect coming into this course. And then lastly, you need to understand API, which is Application Programming Interface. So this whole idea of having a front end and a back end application, where the front end application is making HTTP call to the back end, those back ends, they're usually called API or Application Programming Interface. So make sure you understand what that is and how it's used in this world today, because a lot of the applications running today on the internet, they're running using APIs. So make sure you understand these coming into this course. Environment setup for this course is going to be fairly simple since we'll be working in the front end. So I'll be using Visual Studio Code as my text editor, but you can use whatever editor you like. You don't have to use Visual Studio Code, but I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. And then I'm going to be using Google Chrome. So we're going to need to access the developer tools, and I'm going to be using Google Chrome to do that. So if you want to use Firefox or any other browser, feel free to do that. I'm just showing you guys what I'm going to be using. And then you're going to need a terminal. And this is because we're going to be running the Angular CLI commands in the terminal. So you guys will need to have some sort of a terminal. Now, I didn't even have to put this on there. Most computers nowadays, they come with a terminal. But I'm going to show you how you can get one for Windows where you can run Linux commands into Windows. So this is the setup you need. Most of you guys probably already have all of these already, but let me go ahead and show you where you can get those if you don't have them. So to get Visual Studio Code, you just have to go to code.visualstudio.com, and then you can download it for your operating system. As you can see, they support Mac, Windows, and Linux. So just go here and then download it for your operating system. Pretty simple. Just go through the prompts and then you should be good to go. And then for Chrome, you just have to go to google.com/Chrome, and then you can just download it using this button right here, or you can just click on this button here. And it's going to be fairly simple. Just accept the license and click OK, OK, continue, and then have it install. Now for Windows users, so I'm using this CMDR as my emulator or terminal. So the reason that I like this when I'm on my Windows computer is because I can run Linux commands. So if you go to cmdr.net, if you scroll down, you should see these two buttons here where you can download it on your Windows computer. And the download is going to be fairly simple. Again, accept the license, click OK, continue, and then boom, it's installed. Now, I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm using my Windows computer. So it's going to look like this after you have installed it. And you can see that I can type ls, and then I have the list of all everything that I have in this folder. So you can run Linux commands as well, like you can use SSH and many other Linux commands. I don't think you can use all Linux commands for this, but most of them will work in this emulator. So that's why I like to use it when I'm on my Windows computer. But when we start working on this, when we start developing the applications and writing some code, I'm gonna switch to my Linux computer because I like to use it better for development. So make sure you get those if you want to follow exactly along with what I'm doing. Otherwise, you can use the command line, or if you're on a Mac, you can use whatever terminal you want. You can use any editor you want, and you don't necessarily have to use Chrome, but I'm just showing you guys what I'm gonna be using. I want to quickly talk about Angular a little bit. I know you guys are probably familiar with Angular because you're taking this course about the HTTP aspect of Angular, but I still want to talk a little bit about what Angular is. So Angular is a JavaScript framework, and you can use it to design your application and develop your application. You use it to build client-side single-page application. Angular was designed and created by Google. It's one of the most powerful and one of the most popular JavaScript frameworks out there, and I like to use it. I use it pretty much every day, and I like it a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't any other frameworks or library that you can use. The React.js is also very, very popular. And even I am using React sometimes when I'm working on certain projects. So it really comes down to what I need, what I think will work best for the situation. And then I decide if I want to use React, or if I want to use Angular, or if I want to use Vue, or even jQuery, or just plain old JavaScript. So I know a lot of people like to compare, frameworks out there and libraries and stuff. But in the real world, when you need to build an application, it will come down to what exactly you need to build, how you need to build it. You have to take into consideration like security, scalability, and so many other things. And after you've reviewed everything, or all the requirements for your app, then that's when you're going to make the decision if you want to go with Angular, or if you want to go with React.js, or if you want to go with some other framework like Vue or something else. So in this course, we're going to be looking at the HTTP aspect of the Angular framework. And that's one of the most important features for this framework, because most client-side applications need to manipulate data. And this data is usually hosted on some server somewhere, and you need to use HTTP to make requests to access this data. Let's quickly take a look at the HTTP protocol. Now, HTTP is the protocol that you use every time you try to access resource from a server. Now, it's not the only protocol that you can use to access a server, but it's the most common, and it's the one that the internet or the World Wide Web uses. So that makes it very, very powerful and very popular. Now, the whole thing with HTTP is that when you have a front-end application, you need to fetch resources, as you can see here, from a web server so that you can manipulate this data in the front end for your client side or client facing application. So that's why these front end applications, or this front end JavaScript frameworks such as Angular or React, they use HTTP to fetch resources, and the resource can be anything. It can be HTML documents, it can be videos, it can be even styles, it can be anything. So HTTP is widely used. You use it every day when you access the internet, either on your phone or your computer. And that's the protocol that these applications, that's the protocol that they're using under the hood. Now we can talk way more about HTTP, but this course is not about HTTP itself. It's how we can use Angular and HTTP to fetch resources from servers. But it's also important to understand what it is, which is a protocol, amongst others, that is used to fetch data from a web server or some server somewhere on the internet or somewhere else on a network. Another very important concept that we have to understand is the concept of RESTful Web Service. Now, there's really two parts to this. There's the REST or RESTful, and then there's the web service. Now, REST is really an acronym for representational state transfer. Now, you can think of this just as an architecture that your application can follow. They have certain rules that you have to follow if you want your application or your web service to implement this RESTful or to be RESTful, and then implement this architecture. Now, the second part to this, which is the web service, is that if your web service implements this RESTful architecture, then your web service becomes a RESTful web service. Now, as you can see, most APIs or application programming interface, which is what the front-end applications usually use, they're using this RESTful or representational state transfer architecture so that they can create their application. So we can talk a lot more about REST itself or RESTful web service. But what I really want you to understand is that once we have our front-end application and we're making HTTP requests, we're making HTTP requests to web services. And those web services, most of them, they're using this REST standard, or they're implementing this representational state transfer architecture. And this is really the de facto standard for building web services nowadays. Maybe something else is gonna come and we don't know. But for right now, that's the most powerful and the most lightweight, scalable, maintainable way for building these web services that we want to interact with other web services on the internet. So that's why our Angular application or any front application, they can make an HTTP request to those applications and then get data from them, because they're using this representational state transfer architecture that is a very, again, highly scalable, maintainable, and it's very commonly used for API or web-based application. So earlier I mentioned that we're gonna be using HTTP to make calls to web servers, and those servers, they use this RESTful web service or this RESTful architecture. So maybe this doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but I'm gonna show you how this RESTful web services, I'm gonna show you how it connects to HTTP call that our Angular application will be making. Whenever you have a web service, you want to be able to modify the data on the web service, or read the data, or create data, or delete data. Now, we refer to this as CRUD or CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, delete. And if you think about it, most of the times, or if not all the time, whenever you're using certain applications, you're usually doing one of those operations. So if we take a quick Facebook example, right? So let's say you're on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, and you're just scrolling, you're just looking at what people are talking about, and you're just scrolling and scrolling, you're really reading data. So you're doing the R here in this acronym. Now, if you want to make a post, or you're gonna make a comment on something, or you're gonna send a message to one of your friends, then you're creating data. So in this acronym, you're doing the C, which is like create data. And if you made a post, then you realize you made a mistake or you have a typo, then you go in and you click on edit, and then to edit the data, then you're doing the U in here, which is the update the data. And if you don't like the post, you want to post something else, or you didn't mean to post it and you delete it, then you're deleting the data. And if you think about it, really, most of the times when you're interacting with an application, you're doing one or many of those four operations. So the C is for create, the R is for read or to get data, and then we have the U for update, and then the D for delete. And you can see how this is gonna connect with HTTP to create this entire web service architecture that we're talking about. So the C is for create, and whenever you need to create data on the server, you're gonna send a post request. So they associate the create data or create resource on the server with a post request. So the server or the RESTful API or the RESTful web service, they're able to understand that when you try to communicate with them using the HTTP protocol, and you send the post method with the HTTP protocol, then they understand that your intention is to create resource on that specific server. And the same goes for read. So for reading data, you send a get request. So you're getting information or you're getting resource. So when you send the get request, the server understands, or the web service understands, that you're trying to read data. You're not trying to create or update data or delete data. And then for update, you send a put or a patch request. And I'm going to talk about the difference between put and patch later. When you need to update data on the server, you send a put or a patch request, and then the server is able to understand that you're trying to update the data. And then to delete the data, you send a delete request, which is a valid HTTP method or HTTP verb. So you would send an HTTP delete request, and the server will be able to understand that you're trying to delete a resource on the server. So you can see how with RESTful web service and CRUD operations, we can connect that with HTTP so that we can communicate with the server in a way that the server understands. Let's take a quick look at the HTTP communication with Angular. The HTTP communication is how Angular communicates with backend services using the HTTP protocol. So let's take a look at this and see how this all happens. So you will have your client application, and that client application in our case is going to be the Angular application. So this is your client facing or client side application. So that's the application that your users see. That's the application that they interact with. And then you will have your server. So your server will be your backend web service or your backend web services. That's where all these services are. And somehow you want this backend to be able to communicate with this front end. Notice that the backend can be built using any technology. It can be Python, Java, Node, or a PHP or anything else. Now, what you want to happen is you want your client application, in our case, our Angular application, we want that application to be able to communicate with this backend application to manipulate data or to create, update, read, and delete data. And that communication is going to be done over HTTP. So whenever the client application needs to manipulate data, it will send something called a request over to the server. And the server will take that request, process it, and then send a response back to the client. And then you have this client server communication where the client sends requests over to the server, and then the server sends response back to the client. And this is how the communication happens with the client server communication over HTTP. Now you have to understand that this is just an overview. There is way more that goes into this. But for now, all you have to understand is that the client application using the HTTP protocol will send an HTTP request to manipulate data. So to create data, we'll send a post. To read data, that's going to be a get. To delete data, it's going to be a delete. And to update, it's going to be a put or a patch. And the server is just going to respond with an HTTP response, and then it will send it back to the client. So I hope that makes sense. And we're going to learn how to do all of this in this course. Let's go ahead and create our Angular application. And for this, I'm going to be using the Angular CLI. So let me open my terminal, and I've already navigated to the folder where I want to create that application, and that's in my downloads. And I'm just going to go and do ng new, and I'm going to call the application Angular HTTP and press enter. Yes. Routing, I'm going to say yes for now. I'm going to be using CSS for my styling. And that's going to go ahead and create the application. So I'll pause the video and I'll come back when this is done. All right, the download is finished. So I'm going to go ahead and cd into that folder. So Angular HTTP. And I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to do code that so that I can open this folder with Visual Studio Code. Okay, here we go. So this is a basic Angular application with all the default. I'm pretty sure you guys know how to do this already. We're going to start looking at configuring this application so that we can use HTTP and start making requests. So to configure our application so that our application can start making HTTP requests, we need to do some configuration. So in the main module of our application, in that case, that's going to be our app module, since we only have one module, we're going to have to import the HTTP client module. As you can see here, we're importing that from the Angular/common/HTTP. And this HTTP client module is a service module that is provided by Angular, and it allows us to perform HTTP requests. And once we have the import, you can see down below, we have to add it in our ng modules so that we can let our application know that we're going to be using this HTTP client module. So let's go ahead and give this a try. Let's go into the app folder, and we're going to navigate to the app module.cs file. So this is the main module of our application. And then in here, we need to import the HTTP client module. So I'm going to collapse this, and then right down below this ng module, I'm going to do import. I want to import this from Angular common/HTTP. And what I want to import is the HTTP client module. So I'm going to do HTTP client module. So once we have this imported, we have to pass it into the ng module. So down below here, I'm going to go into the imports array here. I'm just going to go ahead and paste that. So now we have imported the HTTP client module into this ng module, which is the main module of our application. You can think of module like the context of the application, like the space in which the application lives. So now this application is aware of us wanting to use the HTTP client module or the HTTP client to make HTTP call. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Before we can actually start making requests, there is another important concept that we have to understand with Angular, and that's the Angular services. So when you build an Angular application, your application is going to have multiple different components. So you can have a user component, and you might have like a profile component. And that's just the way that the architecture of Angular is. You build your UI using multiple different components, and you just make those components work together. Now, let's say you want to fetch data from your backend API or your backend web service so that you can display this data in your component. Now, you're not going to have every single component in your application making HTTP requests. What Angular comes up with is this idea of creating a service. So you have that one space where you have your services, and every component that needs a specific information can reach to a specific service to get this information. So in this example that I'm showing you right now, we have a user component, and let's just assume that this component is displaying information about like a list of users. And then we have another component, that's the profile component, where we're showing information about one specific user. So you can see those two components, even though there are two separate components, they're requesting information about users. So we can create one service. In that case, we're going to call it our user service. And inside that service, we can have maybe two functions. One to return the list of all the users for the user component, and then another one for the profile of one specific user. So that way your code is more organized and you're not using every single component to make HTTP requests, because you have one service that's making the request, and every component can reach to that specific service if they need that specific data from that service. So what we're going to be doing in our application, we're going to create a service, and then inside that service, we're going to start writing our code to make HTTP calls. My assumption is that you're probably familiar with the Angular CLI, and that's the same command line that I'm going to be using to create the service that I need. So I'm going to scroll down, and we're going to scroll to the command overview, and you can see all the different commands that you can run with the Angular CLI. And the one that I'm looking for is this generate here. And you use this generate to create stuff like to create component, create services, create classes. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this generate here. It's going to take me to a more detailed page of this command. And what I want to do is to use this service here. So this generate service, let's click on that. And you can see to generate a service, you can do ng generate and then service. You pass in the name of the service with some options if you want to, or you can just do ngg and then service and then pass in the name of the service. So I'm going to copy the shortcut command, so the second one, and I'm going to open my terminal. And then I'm just going to go ahead and paste this command. And now I need to give my service a name. What I also like to do when I'm using services with Angular, I like to put all my services inside a folder. And to do this, I'm just going to pass in a new folder. So I'm going to do service. So what Angular is going to do is, or what the Angular CLI is going to do, it's going to place that user service that I'm going to create inside this service folder. And I'm just going to call it user. And Angular is going to take care of adding the .service.ts. So let's go ahead and run this command. I'll say yes on that. And you can see that the Angular CLI created two files for us, the user service.spec.ts and then the user service.ts. So this is how you create a service in Angular. And we're going to take a look at what this service looks like in the code. So I'm back in VS Code. And what I want to do is go to this file explorer here. And you can see that we have this new folder service. And I'm going to go ahead and expand that. And you can see we have our two files. And the files that I'm interested in is the user.service.cs file. Now the spec file is a test file, and we're not going to be doing any testing in this course. But the TS file, the user service TS file, is the file that we're interested in. So let's go ahead and click on that. And you can see that the Angular CLI stubbed out the class for us, putting in the injectable and provide that service in the root of our application, which means this service is going to be provided in the main module of our application, which is the app module that we have. Now, what we need to do is to inject this HTTP client so that we can start making HTTP requests to a backend service. Now we need to inject the HTTP client in our service. And in our case, we have a user service. And the assumption here is that this user service is going to be manipulating data relating to user or users. So the first thing we have to do is to import the HTTP client. So we have to add an import statement in our class so that we can import this HTTP client. And as you can see, it's coming from the same library. So at Angular common/HTTP, that's the same library as the HTTP client module. And then once we have that, we need to inject it in the class. And the way we do this is by passing a private parameter into the constructor in the class. So as you can see, we pass in this private HTTP and we give it a type of the HTTP client that we just imported. What we're really doing is passing in this HTTP as a member of the class. So as a member of the user service class. And what that means is that we'll be able to use this HTTP anywhere in the class by using the this keyword to refer to it, since once we inject it that way, it becomes a member of the user service class. And that's just how you do dependency injection in Angular. So let's go ahead and give this a try. So I'm back in VS Code, and what I want to do is to add in the import for the HTTP client. So I'm going to go below the injectable, and then I'm going to do import. And then here, I want to import the HTTP client. So I'm going to do HTTP client. And this is coming from the same module. So we're going to do from, and then pass in Angular common, and then /HTTP. So now that we've imported this, we have to inject it into this class. And to do this, we just have to pass in a private field to the constructor. So I'm going to do private. And I'm just going to call it HTTP. You can give it any name you want. The only thing is you have to make sure that the type is of type HTTP client. So I'm going to do HTTP client, which is what we just imported. So now this HTTP is available in this user service class, and we can use it anywhere in the class by just using the this keyword to refer to it as a member of the class. So once we start building our function to make HTTP requests, you're going to see how we're going to be using this as a member of the class by using the this keyword so that we can make our request to the backend. Now that we have injected the HTTP client in our user service, we can make use of it in that service so that we can make HTTP requests. And there are a few ways that you can make HTTP requests inside of the service in Angular, but I'm going to show you one of the most common ways to make those requests. So you typically see a function, and inside that function, you return the HTTP call that you're making to the API. As you can see here, our function name is defined. In that case, that's get users, and it doesn't take any parameters. But notice one interesting thing is the return type. And in this case, that's the observable. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about observable, but for now, what you need to understand is that observable here means that this code is going to resolve at a later point in time because we're making a network call and we want to be notified whenever we get some data back. In that case, that would be the HTTP response from the server. And that can be the data that we requested, or we can get an error from the server. And then on the second line, we call the HTTP. Remember, we define it in the constructor, which makes it a member of the class. So we're using the this keyword to access it. And then on that HTTP, we access the get because we're trying to make a get request. And this HTTP also contains the post, put, patch, and delete, and a couple more. But in that case, since we're trying to retrieve data, we're calling the get, and then we're passing in the type that we're expecting to get from this API here. In our case, api.com/users. So this API, http://api.com, it's going to return an array of users or a list of users. So the same way we're telling the observable that we're expecting an array of users, we have to tell the get, which is also generic, the type of data that it's supposed to receive from that call. And what the HTTP client is going to do is it's going to deserialize this data whenever this data is resolved or whenever we get the response. And then it's going to parse it as an array of users. Another example of this is if we're trying to get one user. So in that case, we can define another function, which we're going to call get user. It doesn't take any parameter. And the return type is also an observable because this code is not going to resolve immediately. It's going to take some time because we have to make a network call. And then the return type, or in the body of the response, we're expecting to get a user. And you can see we're doing the same thing on the second line. When we call the get, we pass in the type of data, and then we pass in the URL where we think this data lives on that web service. So this is the typical, most common way that you would see the HTTP client being used on an Angular service. And later in this course, I'm going to show you a more advanced way that you can do this. And there's really no right or wrong. It's just a matter of what your requirements are. So sometimes you might have an application and it's so complex, you might have to go with the basic way. But sometimes your application might not be so complex, and then you can use a more fancy, a more advanced way to do this. So for now, let's go ahead and give this method a try. I'm going to be using the JSON placeholder, and if you go to jsonplaceholder.tpcode.com, you should land on this page. And as it says here, you can see that it's a free fake API for testing and prototyping. And it's really free. You can just use it to test your application. And if we scroll down a little bit, and you can see here how to try it. So you see the main URL is the actual website itself. So that's the base URL. And then they have a number of resources that you can interact with. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that you can get posts, comments, album, photos, to-dos, and users. So we're going to be using the last one, which is the users. And there's really plenty free APIs online that you can use to test your application, but I'm just going to be using this one for now. So back in our user service, I'm going to go down the constructor, and then I'm going to define our first function. In that case, it's the get users. And remember, it doesn't take any parameter, and it returns an observable of user array. So now we're going to pass user array. Now, we haven't defined this user type yet, and later we're going to define an interface to represent the type of data that we're requesting. But for now, let's go ahead and finish the function. So here, I'm going to call the HTTP. So I'm going to do return this HTTP, and then I'm going to call the get on it. As you can see here, we have the delete, get, head, JSON options, and we're going to look at those later. And then we also have the put. So for now, we're going to use the get request because we're trying to make a request to some API to retrieve data. And then we have to pass in the URL where this data lives. And this is going to be the JSON placeholder. So here I can just pass in the URL for JSON placeholder, and then that's going to go to /users. So this is our first function, and don't forget to pass in the type as well for the get. So here we're going to pass in the type, and then let's go ahead and define our second function. So I'm going to copy the first one, go down a little bit, and this is supposed to be get users, and this is get user. This is going to return one user, and I'm going to remove the bracket and pass in the ID here. Let's say in this case, we're going to pass in 1. So now what we need to do is to define this user here so that we can map this data properly. You can see that we're getting errors here in those functions because TypeScript doesn't know where to get this user from. So now what we have to do is to go to JSON placeholder and see if we can understand exactly what are the properties that exist on this user so that we can map that user into this class here. So a good use of interfaces is to just use them to define a type of a specific object. So let's go back to JSON placeholder and let's scroll down to the user, because that's what we're interested in. So here's the user resource. I'm just going to open this in a new tab just so I can see the response. So here's the list of all the users, and you can see one user here from line 5 to line 27. And the user has an ID, name, username, email, an address, which is an object, as you can see here. And this object contains another object. In this case, that's the geolocation. As you can see here, it's nested inside of the address, which is also an object for the user. And then we have a phone, website, and a company, which is also an object, as you can see, that's defined here. So we need to map this data in our HTTP call so that we can deserialize it properly so that we can have intelligence whenever we get this data back. So what I like to do is to use this website here called transform.tools, and you can specify what language you want to transform to and from. So here, I'm just going to copy this first user here, which defines the type of the user. And I'm just going to go back here and I'm going to remove this, and then I'm going to paste it. And if you look to the right, you can see that it defines all of the type for us and also the subtype, and it defines the user. In that case, it's setting it at root, but we can change that. And then it passes in the address and the company, and inside of the address, we have the geolocation. And the geolocation is also defined below. So we can define all of those interfaces so that we can create our user service. Now, we don't have to define it that way. We can use the type keyword in TypeScript to define types. And we can also use open and close curly braces and define the type of a data using an object literal. But I'm just going to go with this approach in this situation. So what I also want you to see is the Angular CLI. You can use it to generate interface. As you can see here, you can just pass in ng generate interface, and then you pass in the name of the interface. So I'm going to use this command, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy it, and then I'm going to open my terminal. So make sure you are inside of your application. As you can see here, I am inside of my application, and I'm just going to paste this command. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to copy this again, open my terminal, and I'm going to delete this, paste this command, and I want to put all of those interfaces inside of an interface folder. So I'm going to pass interface and then / user and press enter. So now I have this user interface, and also we need to define the other interfaces. So let's go back so that I can see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to shrink this a little bit. So we have to define the user. In that case, that was the root and then the address. So I'm going to run this one more time for address. And I'm also going to do it for geo. I'm going to remove this geo. And I need to do it one more time for company. And I'm going to run that. All right, so now I have all my interfaces. So let's go back to the application. And let's expand this panel. And here's the interface folder. And I can extend it. You can see we have all of our classes in here. So what I can do is just copy the information that I got into those classes. So the first one is going to be the root. So let's go back to JSON. Let's see if we can put those side by side. So I have both of my windows side by side, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything over. So I'm just going to copy all of this and then paste it in for user. And I like to have the semicolon, so I'm going to put those in. And I'm going to do the same for the address. So I'm going to copy everything here and go back here to the address and paste everything here. And I have to do the same for the geo. So I'm going to open the geo, copy everything for geo, paste it in there. And I need to do the last one, which is the company. So I'm going to copy everything here and paste it in the company. Again, I like to have the semicolon, but it's not required. I'm going to close that and do the same here. Close this. Now I have to import this, so I can just use the quick fix to import it. And I'm going to expand this because we don't need this anymore. Now I can go to users and import those classes or those interfaces. So I'm going to import this from the address and import the company as well. All right, so now our user is defined. So this is the shape of our user. So all we have to do now is to import that user in this class. And we can use the quick fix to do that. Quick fix, import. So at this point, we're ready to go ahead and test those functions.